It is a very good idea to leave a sinking ship. They lie to you, GI. You know you cannot win this war. Your rich leaders grow richer while you die in the swamp, GI. They will give you a medal, GI, but only after you are dead. Your government lies to you every day, poor soldier.
Okay, so I'm gonna go into this video assuming you know vaguely what the Vietnam War was, at least. A me video where the introduction isn't like half the video essay. Incredible. But first, I have a United States thermonuclear missile delivered to me personally by Barry Goldwater himself, and he has informed me that we must use it against the North Vietnamese because, reasons. So if you allow me to demonstrate, and 1, and 2, and... Nice.
This comic artist and content creator was in a major kerfuffle because they were found out for being a PDF file.
Scoreboard! Scoreboard!
So, it's the New Year. How exciting, but in Vietnam, the New Year comes a bit later than it does in the West due to their lunar solar calendar, which causes the New Year to fall somewhere between the 20th and 30th of January for us. And being a national holiday, both the North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese agreed to a 36-hour-long ceasefire so nobody would get killed during the celebrations. Hey, so can we sign a truce for a little while? Yeah, sure, we don't want any insurgent operations taking place during one of the most festive times of the year. You know, I'm not gonna lie. I was just kidding, I just lied. Viet Cong soldiers deeply infiltrating inside the South to disguise themselves as civilian participators in the celebrations, all the meanwhile stockpiling large quantities of weaponry for their surprise attack under the assumption that the South Vietnamese people would launch a revolt in support of the Communists, which, considering South Vietnam's political situation, or just any Southeast Asian countries for that matter, wasn't that bad of a plan. What about the 500,000 US soldiers backing the South Vietnamese government? They'll probably defect, and there'll be enough casualties inflicted on them to pull out eventually. The Politburo in North Vietnam gave the okay to the Viet Cong, and the general tactical approach was just sort of more insurgency, more guerrilla warfare, which makes sense, you know? Guerrilla warfare, that's Chairman Mao. And the Viet Cong began shifting reliance more and more on the Ho Chi Minh Trail system, allowing insurgents to secure a pathway along a key supply route that was unbreakable, no matter how many times the Americans tried to destroy it. The trail itself was also pretty close to the Tay Ninh province, where the Viet Cong held a significant presence, regularly fighting off South Vietnamese and American advances inwards in the border region with Cambodia. The Chinese, as well, were essentially throwing equipment at an open gate to Hanoi, and the Viet Cong were ready to begin their offensive. On the night of January 30th, they began their attacks on Saigon, Da Nang, Hue, and Khe Sanh. Khe Sanh, if you're wondering, is the funny Call of Duty city that you spent 35 minutes trying to get past the trench systems on in veteran difficulty. The Viet Cong were able to execute the offensive due to a lot of messy stuff going on behind the US command structure. You'd think the most powerful country in the world could see the enemy moving around for such a massive campaign. It's not unreasonable to think that LBJ could have seen something coming from a mile away like George Bush on September 11th. The Americans did notice the significant buildup taking place and increased action along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but made a grave error. They underestimated the Vietnamese will to, not ability to fight in a campaign like this. What also didn't really help matters was the fact that the US Vietnamese intelligence bases weren't the most connected, unlike the modern day where the US shares its intelligence with its European allies. Okay, not anymore. Whilst in Vietnam, the two are practically competing with one another. Like, come on, pipe down, little brother, you're Papa State, what's your goal here? And the Viet Cong's offensive was given a huge boost before it even started. As Viet Cong soldiers launched their surprise attacks across the country, multiple armies of both South Vietnam and America were put under intense pressure, particularly in Pleiku along the hills of the country, where multiple strategic points fell attacked from all sides. The South was caught completely off guard, and the Cong pushed furtherwards into Da Nang and Khe Sanh, but the Viet Cong also had to contend with the extensive deployments of the US Air Force, who were raining down bombs on their positions in the urban areas and in the countryside, causing a lot of casualties on both sides, with the Viet Cong taking the brunt of the deaths as they usually did. On top of the high death count, it was becoming apparent that the point of the plan around the offensive seemed not be coming to fruition anytime soon. In fact, there wasn't any mass-scale defection surrounding the communists throughout the entirety of the campaign. But, like with most of the battles, this didn't deter them at all, and the operation continued nonetheless, and inside Khe Sanh, the Americans in the city were put under a devastating siege which lasted for months on end. The siege would see a partial break and relief for the Americans as part of Operation Pegasus in April of that year. but the North Vietnamese were still able to achieve a tactical victory despite them losing a bare minimum of over 2,500 fighters in the offensive, with some other estimates even saying they lost 5,000. They had broken the long-held McNamara defensive line, which was held up by US and South Vietnamese forces to prevent the Viet Cong from moving further inland into the country, but this breakthrough had allowed them to infiltrate and drive further into Southern territory, continuing their fight behind enemy lines. The Cong also had their eyes set on the most important city in the south, Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital. It was attacked and infiltrated by insurgents who stormed multiple government buildings, military positions, and homes of important South Vietnamese generals and local leaders. As mentioned before, this didn't trigger any massive revolts or revolution, but the effect it had in the minds of the US commanders would certainly be a major factor in the coming future. Further north in South Vietnam, this country needs a better name, Hue City also saw intensive fighting between the two factions, and hundreds of thousands of civilians were caught in the crossfire of the two armies crashing down on them, as the Cong captured key positions along the front line, positions which had to be recaptured later on by American support. But this was only after the Cong committed a massacre inside of Hue City itself against POWs and civilians suspected of having loyalty to the South. But don't get confused now, both sides throughout the Tet Offensive and the entirety of the Vietnam War committed various strings of massacres, war crimes, executions, other heinous actions. Now, the military defeats were because the South Vietnamese army wasn't exactly doing well for itself. It often had to be supported by local anti-communist volunteer militias, citizen support, which it didn't really have, and of course, the US Expeditionary Force in the country. Johnson, the enemy has surrounded. Our intelligence program is outdated. We're getting screwed out here. But aren't we meant to be fighting the communists? I mean, yeah, of course. Then send in more! Okay, I don't think this is working anymore. The offensive is largely remembered by the US public as what turned the tide of the Vietnam War, but in reality, it was incredibly costly for the communists. They had taken key positions and laid the ground for a future, but it sustained to 100,000 dead and many more wounded, with some also being captured and executed by Allied forces. This figure made up about 60% of the Viet Cong's entire army, whilst the South Vietnamese, on the other hand, only lost about 20,000 to death and capture, with the American counterparts, along with the South Korean, Australian, Laotian, and other Allied troops, losing about 12,000 dead and 2,000 captured or missing in action. This is accounting for the initial attacks and two other smaller offensives which were lumped in with the Tet Offensive afterwards. The Communists failed to incite defection in South Vietnam. In America, however, it was a bit different. Public attitude toward the war continued to tank as heavy casualty figures and sheer destruction from the conflict shocked the US public, as if the previous years already had him. And the people wanted it to end, especially as more troops were drafted into the fight in that same war. On top of that, Johnson, I don't know, Jumbo maybe, had some comments that didn't sit quite well with the US public. The road for pulling out of Vietnam was continuing to be built. The Tet Offensive wasn't the last nail in the coffin, but I think it was certainly the strongest. And just 5 years later, the US pulled out of Vietnam completely, and North Vietnam won the war. An unpopular president, higher enemy casualties, a long drawn-out war. We're never going to do that again. For future plans, yes.